Welcome to Discover Lafayette. I'm Jan Swift. In part 2 of our series about how the city of Lafayette brought fiber optics to its citizens, I continue my discussion with Terry Huval and the other principals involved, Joey Durel, Pat Ottinger, as well as our current parish president, Joel Robideaux. I hope you enjoy this as much as I have, and thanks to LUS Fiber for making the show possible. Terry, we're really honored to have Mayor President Joel Robideaux with us today. Joel, thank you for joining us.
No, glad to be here.
Yeah, Discover Lafayette is about promoting all the good initiatives going on in Lafayette, and Terry and I have been discussing the history of the Lafayette Utility System Fiber to the Home initiative. When you were elected in 2016, you really took office at a very fortunate time. The legal battles had been won, and fiber was implemented throughout the city. What did that mean for you when you were a candidate? Were you looking ahead to what that meant for your candidacy and eventual service as mayor?
Sure. The whole fiber initiative, and that starts back in '98 with the fiber ring and then the fiber to the home. It positions Lafayette so well that whether it's for my administration and really for all the administrations that are going to follow, it puts Lafayette in a position to capitalize on this fiber in ways that most other cities just dream of. And we're going to be able to implement a lot of smart city strategies, sensors, data analytics, and be able to make decisions in real time and do things that benefit the citizens that without fiber we just wouldn't even be able to have those conversations.
What is a smart city? What do people mean by that?
Yeah, it's kind of the new buzz term, smart city, but really when you hear that, you really do want to just think, well, how do we manage our traffic in real time? How do we have sensors and the instruments in place to see what's happening? We know 5 o'clock, we know morning traffic, but we have to physically monitor when traffic's backing up at a certain intersection because of an accident or just because of it happens to be a graduation that day. Well, we have the technology now to be able to put these sensors out that are going to use some versions of artificial intelligence and just really smart technology that can do a lot of that for us and automatically make the adjustments 3, 4, 5, light locations away, traffic signal locations away, to make those decisions and to more efficiently manage that traffic rather than it being a human that's looking at the monitors and looking at the data. So that, our drainage, knowing where the bottlenecks are in the cooling system, and for certain levels of rain events, 7 inches in 3 hours versus 3 inches in a half hour. Those two are different rain events, and right now the way we manage that is based on phone calls and what Public Works is able to find out where the effects of that type of rain. Well, with sensors and data, we'll know every different type of rain event where the problem areas are and how to fix that and where we should focus our attention. And so it's those types of things that seem intuitive, and it makes you a smart city. But again, it takes technology to be able to get there, and because of the fiber grid that we have, we're in a perfect spot to be able to implement those types of things.
Right. Terry, when you were starting the Fiber to the Home initiative, are the things that Joel's talking about, was that even on the radar? Did you anticipate that?
I mean, not specifically, obviously, but the idea of having a communications network throughout the city just opens up lots of opportunities. And we always felt like, for example, like traffic flow could be one of the things that could benefit from that.
We don't like that.
Well, and because it's such a frustrating thing for so many people, and if you can get the lighting synchronized so that it really does enable the most cars to go through it at one time, then you're doing something great for the community. But yeah, it was always something like, at that time, I don't think we ever thought about flooding issues. That wasn't one of the things that was really happening that much in those days. Right. But having that full city network is what makes a difference. Fiber along every street.
Right. And then from an economic development standpoint, Joel, we've had the large companies like CGI, Proficient, I don't even know who to name, but we have really enjoyed an influx of technology companies. How does the fiber initiative help you as mayor to attract business and be on the radar?
Well, the fiber piece is the calling card, right? I mean, we've got a great university, we've got a really unique, authentic culture. So a lot of things make Lafayette attractive, right? And when you also can have the level of connectivity that fiber gives us, these technology companies realize, wow, I'm getting these incredible things, plus it's one of the most connected cities in America. You know, it just automatically elevates us into the discussions. And so, you know, everyone sees the ones we land, but we're in discussions all the time with some really significant companies that are considering Lafayette, and really the consideration has as much to do with fiber as anything else.
Right. You know, for those of us that have lived here for years or were born here, it's hard to realize that Lafayette really is considered to be the gem. We take a lot of this for granted. And people look at Lafayette in a different light because of this type of ingenuity for moving ahead when the community didn't have to. So I've been interested watching your initiatives, including Create. Do initiatives like that, do they benefit from this fiber?
Well, absolutely. I mean, one of the things, you know, also that Terry and those guys probably weren't thinking is the whole digital film entertainment and just the amount of data that is carried over these fiber lines now is incredible, and that industry is changing, you know, weekly. But it's a huge industry, and they look for places that they can actually do their craft and bring us jobs, and it takes the capacity that the fiber, you know, gives us. And so, yeah, it's there's a lot of really great things that are happening because of that.
I tell my daughters, they're now 19 and 26, you know, just a few short years ago, if I was looking at editing video, I had to have the disc, put it in the computer and hope that that worked. But to be able to stream videos like they do, and just to be able to do what we're doing and, you know, digitize it so quickly and transmit it, it's really miraculous to me, because I've seen in just a short time how things have changed here, particularly in Lafayette, and what we can do for the rest of the country.
Yep.
Terry, previous generations of leaders took steps to implement Lafayette utility system, and because of that, we already had a history of having a municipally owned utility system. Can you two talk about that? Like, where are we going from now? Because really, Joel, not only did you inherit this system, but you inherited the leadership from past generations to do something more than what you have to do. So if y'all could talk about that, please.
I think each generation, each mayor, each utility director, the things that we have done sets the stage for something down the road that people prior to us could not have envisioned. And just like there are some things related to the fiber system that we couldn't have envisioned. But because we have this infrastructure in place now, it just opens up the door to things that we can't even imagine. But the good news is that it's a project, it's an infrastructure that's not dated. It's not going to run out of style. It's going to always be, you're going to always need fiber connectivity to be able to provide data flow. No matter what anybody says about what you can do with wireless, there's always going to be limiting factors on wireless. You only can put so much of that stuff in the air. But when you're using fiber, you now have, the only limitation you have is whatever's the latest technology of the day. And as soon as the technology changes, as soon as the boxes on each end of the fiber changes, then you catapult to the next level.
So Joel, right now the service from LUS is the city of Lafayette. What are the plans for future expansion beyond our city limits?
Yeah, sure, and building on what Terry said is, you know, when the initial thought of fiber was how can LUS use this to be one of the most innovative and efficient utility systems, and they did that, right? And then the natural expansion went to the homes, and then the natural expansion is, all right, well, how do we use this in these smart city ways? And so it's up to us, you know, pressure's on for us to try to have some vision and anticipate what some of the uses will be, but to make sure that, you know, we do position ourselves for all the future generations to take advantage of this incredible infrastructure. The demand from outside the city, right, is constant. I think Terry can attest to that. I mean, we get calls all the time, when can we get fiber? We want fiber, you know, to our neighborhood, to our home. And the reality is it's a business model, right? So we can't just say, okay, Jan, you want it, you've got it if you live outside the city. So we have to analyze all of that data, and Terry and those guys do a great job, but when the situation exists where we know the demand's there, and we know that there's going to be a significant utilization rate, and it makes business sense, then we're willing to expand out into these other neighborhoods, and we've done that now twice. And again, when you do that, the demands from other neighborhoods are coming in fast and furious because everybody wants it, and they want it because it's a great package for them to have. And so we're analyzing those continuously. We're going to continue to provide it to areas that make sense, and our only aversion is that it's a business model, and when it makes business sense for us to bring fiber to different neighborhoods, we're going to do it.
Right. To keep it on the positive side, yeah, on the ledger sheet, as you're very
That's right.
familiar with.
We want to stay in the black.
Right, right. Well, I hope to see that for our parish. That'll be good news. And thank you again for taking time today,
Sure,
Joel.
glad
It's
to.
always good to see you. I'd like to now welcome Joey Durel, who's our immediate past president of, parish president of Lafayette. Joey, thank you for joining us today.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, we're focusing on, obviously, the LUS Fiber to the Home initiative. And Terry's been talking about the background of it, and he did make a statement that without you serving in office for 12 years, that the initiative would not have been completed. So we'd like to hear from you, if you can talk about when you were elected, what you were looking at in our community, and I guess, asking Terry to stay on.
Yeah.
If you can talk about that, what you thought at the time about the
Do we want to talk
Lafayette
about all
utility.
that?
Yeah, and you have to tell the truth,
Oh, well, I am no longer a politician, so I guess I do have to tell the truth, huh? Well, I ran in 2003, and every politician gets asked a question. Everybody who runs for the first time, and that question is, why in the world would you do this to you and your family? And my answer was immediate and sincere, and that was, I want my kids to stay home. I want them to have the opportunity to stay home. And that means jobs. We can talk about a lot of really nice sounding things around a community and all the things you can have, but if your children grow up and can't support their family, they leave. And what I said very many times in my 12 years is, we're not going to lose our culture because strange people move in. We will lose our culture because our people have to move out. And so my point of that is, everything I ran on had that as my backdrop. I knew that economic development, jobs, were the key to the success of a community. I always felt that a community did not stay stagnant. It either grew or it died. And growth sounds better than death to me. And you can look not far from Lafayette to see communities that have not grown in many, many, many years, and it's depressing. Lafayette, I felt, had to lead the way. So one of the things that triggered my running for office was having been the chairman of the board of the Chamber of Commerce of Lafayette in 2001. By the time you achieve that sort of level of leadership in an organization like the Chamber of Commerce, you've gotten a pretty good overview of what makes your community tick. And having been involved with that, and knowing that when LUS a few years before had to replace its microwave communication system among its substations, the Chamber had pushed very hard for there to be used fiber optics. And so I was aware of the fiber optic ring we had in Lafayette. I was aware of the fact that there were a lot of techie kind of people involved with the Chamber of Commerce saying we could do so much more with our ring. I didn't quite know what that meant necessarily, but you hear bits and pieces, and again, as chairman of the board of the Chamber of Commerce, you kind of get a good overview, and as I said often, you become a jack of all trades and a master of none. You see what a lot of people are doing, but you don't understand all the specifics. So anyway, I get elected, despite the fact that Terry Huval had campaigned heavily against me, and
Terry.
And so he was put in a very unfortunate position, and I knew it. And I knew Terry enough to know before that it wasn't, it wasn't a comfortable thing for him to do. But anyway, so I go to visit Terry a month or so before I got sworn in to talk about him remaining on as director. And so we get that kind of out of the way. And Terry walks over to his desk and pulls a kind of a loose leaf binder out of a drawer and says, "Let me show you something that my team has brought back from a Fiber to the Home conference." And he starts going through some things. It's got a lot of little pennies on the pictures and shows how many pennies we could save our citizens on their phone bill and or on their television bill. And we talk about internet. And after he shows some of that, I said, well, Terry, I said, why would we do something that the private sector is already doing? And we have some more conversation. Then we start talking about internet and potential economic development possibilities. And as I stood up to leave, I said, shame on us if we don't at least look into this, and shame on us if we don't take this until we get to a hurdle that we can't get past.
We spoke about the history of Lafayette and the strong leadership that set the tone for this, going back to the 1800s. We didn't talk about the road network, but of course we became the hub city because the community had the foresight to build roads linking to other towns. And then in the 1890s, the city again took a strong step forward by enacting and implementing Lafayette utility system. But this is just as big, the fourth utility, internet, fiber, as any of those other initiatives. Did you ever, when you were in the thick of it, did you ever stop and think, what have I done?
I think sometimes when we look back, it's hard to believe that we accomplished what we accomplished. When you look at so many communities around the country that have tried to do the same thing and have not been able to do it, maybe, but what I did say often was the good news about being a brand new politician hadn't been around long enough to know what we couldn't do, you know. And for me, having come from the private sector where I had opened multiple businesses, small businesses, but opened multiple businesses over the years, this was very exciting to me because I got to continue that sort of mentality. You know, we were starting a brand new business, and that was fun for me. I enjoyed it. You know, in fact, I remember telling people when they'd say, Joey, how do you deal with the pressure? How do you deal with all of that? I said, what they don't realize is I love the battle. You know, and it was. I mean, I think, and Terry, I know, say the same thing, but when you know you're doing the right thing for the right reasons, it's easier to deflect the bullets.
You obviously trusted Terry Huval's judgment and expertise, because otherwise this would have been a very tough battle.
We never would have done this if I didn't feel strongly about Terry's integrity. That is something that can't be overstated, because I come in, I'm the new guy, I know ultimately I have to make the decision. It's going to all rest on me, failure or success or whatever. I would blame as much as I could on Terry if it failed, but you know, it would have been the Durel administration or whatever. With all the technical things, with all the legal battles, with all the PR stuff, nothing would have gone past square one if I didn't feel strongly about Terry's integrity and his dedication to this community and to this system.
I know it was important to you to get the best team that you could. And I mean, just given the size of Lafayette Utility Systems' budget, just that alone, without even taking on the fiber initiative, you had to trust Terry for his management skills.
Right.
But I do remember looking back in time as we've been reminiscing, that was tough. There were a lot of challenges, and you never handled it like a politician, though. I think you were always more of a public servant.
What do you think?
You know, saying what you thought.
Well, you know, I mean,
you know,
the truth is, it's funny. You're right, and I will take that as a compliment.
It is meant as a
because
compliment.
if it was, if I had handled it like a competition, like a politician, never would have happened.
But Terry was mentioning that throughout this whole journey, having the right team by your side was very important. He mentioned Randy Haney, lobbyist, and of course Pat Ottinger and other legal counsel. You had to have the right team anticipating these roadblocks.
You know, don't forget, I'm a brand new guy in here, brand new mayor, had never been in politics before. And so, you know, I know what I don't know. I mean, I don't know what I don't know, but my point is I know that I'm weak on a lot of aspects of government. And so it was important to me to surround myself with the right people. But one of the things I did, and I say this every time I go speak about this, is that I asked 5 very conservative people, business people, who were using a lot of technology way back then. And it's funny because that technology way back then wasn't very much, but they were still ahead of a lot of their peers. And these 5 business people, asked them to kind of be an advisory group to me, and they worked with Terry a lot. They sat in on meetings, they sat in on discussions, and it was an important aspect of this. And the names I can remember was Bill Fenstermaker, Clay Allen, I think maybe Jerry Gregg, Keith Thibodeau, and Max Hoyt, maybe?
Max Hoyt, or, yeah, Max Hoyt was on there too, right?
Yeah. So these are 5 people that were really leading the way in their individual businesses and in their world in technology. But I also want to make sure they were very conservative, because I knew if this thing continued on past that hurdle that I thought we might run into, we needed to have somebody, because once you get elected, you can be a businessman, and people say, we need a businessman in that position. But as soon as you raise your hand and say, I do, or I am, or yes, you're now a politician, right? And so I knew as a politician, as a government employee, we would lack a certain amount of credibility to certain aspects of the community. So by appointing these 5 guys, asking these 5 people to sit in and be a part of kind of a buffer between me being swayed too much by the government people, because again, don't forget I'm brand new, and also as a buffer between government and the business community. And I believe that played a huge role, although somewhat subtle, in our success, because they became advocates for it, and they helped become salesmen in the business community for what this could mean for Lafayette. And so by the time Berkeley calls Lafayette, at least they did several years ago, the 9th most conservative city in America today, and this 9th most conservative city, by the time it went to a vote, was so well educated on the possibilities that 62% of the people said yes. And to me, that's a result of everything that we did, including town hall meetings and controversy, that educated this community.
We were joking earlier that people didn't really know what fiber was.
No,
we thought it was like Metamucil.
Yeah, that's right, that's right.
And so I think by having the opponents and the controversy, people were educated, and that's the vote you want.
Yeah.
You want people,
sure,
if they're against it and they have the facts, well, that's their prerogative.
That's okay,
But to let people have exposure to all the facts,
that's right,
and be able to weigh it for themselves,
right,
is it worth the risk? And that is what happened. And we'd mentioned earlier too that timing was really important, because with the apathy today, it's just a different day. Here, just a decade so later.
But and don't forget, Lafayette in 2004 wasn't that many years away from the big downturn in the oil and gas industry of the mid '80s. In fact, that didn't really rebound. It wasn't until the early '90s or whatever else that you really started seeing the comeback. But for a lot of people in Lafayette, that memory was pretty recent, and so the conversation of diversifying our community was an important backdrop to a lot of this. That and when this last downturn happened, I can tell you, Lafayette City wasn't affected. Lafayette's sales taxes did not go down as much as they did 3 years after Katrina happened in Lafayette. We averaged about 5% down. They were averaged 2.3% down in the last couple of years ago, and I've heard Greg Gautreaux say that in the '80s, about 80% of our economy was dependent on the oil and gas industry. When it happened this past time, about 40-something% of our economy was dependent on the oil and gas community. So it's certainly not all because of fiber, but fiber is a component that helps us diversify our community. Right. I mean, CGI wasn't affected by the downturn, because they do business all over the world with customers and companies all over the world.
And our healthcare professionals, I know, depend on these fast networks, and they're thriving. So
that's right.
Yeah, that's good news.
Yep. Terry did assemble a really good team. When we talk about all the components, there's no doubt the components around the community that it took to get the vote, to get to say yes, was one thing. But as I pointed out to Terry and them at that time, when it was a yes, I said, as a small business person going to the bank, I would sometimes work at the bank and fight with the bank for 6 months, 8 months, 9 months, and finally they would say yes. And I walk out of the bank all excited, and I think, oh, that was the easy part. And so we got to yes, And I told them that analogy, and I said, this was the easy part. Now you got to make it work.
Right.
And
Big test.
to Terry's managerial style, his dedication, he assembled not just a good team, but a team that was very loyal to him and very loyal to this Department of Utilities that we have here in Lafayette. And you know, and Terry was in my office more than one time fighting for those employees and pushing for those employees, and he had to do a lot of maneuvering because of civil service. I mean, here you are, you're purely a department of the government, just like Parks and Recreation or Public Works, but you compete in the private sector, and you don't fund yourself with taxes. You're self-supporting. You have to bring in, and so in other words, you're competing with the private sector, and you're competing with the private sector not just in rates and things like that, but you're competing to keep your employees.
Talent.
And when you're dealing in a civil service system that says this is how much an engineer such and such gets paid, well, in the private sector, those same engineers are getting paid this. And Terry had, because of LUS's structure with various other entities and the way it's set up, it was set up, thank goodness, by our forefathers to be able to compete in the private sector. And there's some methods he had, but I mean, the point is, it's a difficult system and very frustrating, I know, to Terry. I'm sure we were a source of some of his frustration because, you know, I came into it to a certain set of rules, and, you know, I mean, I'm hearing Terry's side of the story, I'm hearing this side of the story, and I'm having a, you know, so Terry had plenty of frustrations. We had many discussions of various ways to approach it, but my point is, when you talk about what Terry did and what we got done to get it done, you know, to me, from that point forward, Terry said, you know, something about my 12 years, but the truth is, I always felt, not that my job was finished after we got to say yes, but certainly, Terry's ability to assemble a really good team, and I think that was something that we always had, was, you know, getting Jim Ballard in here, getting Pat Ottinger. You know, we had always the goal of having the best people at the table, and I think Terry's done a great job with that.
The diversity in the skill set was critical.
Yeah.
It gave us a really good opportunity to see everything from a very 360-degree pattern. We learned a lot from each other in the process.
Yeah. Thank goodness. I enjoy Netflix coming through quickly, you know.
Yeah. You know, I wrote an article for Broadband Magazine, I guess, I don't know, gosh, 6 or 7, 8 years, I forget when it was now, but my last paragraph, I always remember, I said, you know, we're now talking about 100 megabits per second, and that was a big deal, you know, because by the time we got our system in place, that was one of the negatives to their holding us back as long as they did, because by the time we were able to actually deliver it, we were able to put in the technology to deliver 100 megabits per second and actually let people who bought 10 megabits per second peer-to-peer go 100 megabits per second, which was a big deal, you know. And but in that last paragraph of that article that I wrote, I remember saying, you know, predicting that within a few years, I bet you were laughing about 100 megabits per second, never realizing that as soon as now we'd be talking about 10 gigabits, you know, which is 10,000 megabits per second. You know, I mean, it's mind-boggling.
And most of us don't understand that. We just enjoy it.
Yeah, that's right.
So.
And the thing is, we won't know how much you won't know how much you enjoy it. You know, I think one of the sayings we used when we were going through our little town hall meetings and stuff is that the old saying was necessity was the mother of invention. And we started saying, with this, invention is the mother of necessity. In other words, nobody's been thinking about, not nobody, but I mean, many of us in our community haven't been wondering, what do we do with 100 megabits per second, much less a gigabit or 10 gigabits? But having that available now has medical applications and engineering applications and, you know, video applications and no telling what else. So, you know, we don't know what this future holds, you know. I mean, that's what's always been kind of exciting to me is.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier in my interview with her is that as I learn more, as I've been in this for a little while longer now, is that, you know, I keep going back to that analogy we had about electricity, you know, and how important that was in the 1930s. And in those days, when my grandparents had electricity, they had enough electricity for a light bulb, maybe the refrigerator, the radio. And that was enough for them.
Right.
But as time went on, they got an air conditioner, and they got, you know, they got a stove, and they got a washing machine and so forth. And so when we start talking about the speed, when somebody says, what are you going to do with 100 megabits per second or a gig or 10 gigs? It's not that you need the stuff that fast. It's just that you have so many other things using that bandwidth
right.
that, you know, if you're going to get all the things you want to get done, you're going to have something bigger.
Right.
And you see it today, all the applications of things you can do at your home. And, you know, we're just at the beginning of all that. So that's what the speed is about. It's not just a bragging right. Although on the front end it is to show, you know, how capable the system we built really is in the long term. But it's also to recognize that there's going to be more and more and more and more uses of internet as we go along that are going to require that to happen.
Right. You know, Terry said it first years ago, was that, but my parents, not my grandparents, my parents referred to the electric bill as the light bill. Mm-hmm. I grew up calling the refrigerator the icebox. My parents saw pre-refrigerators, electric refrigerators, you know, and so he's right. I mean, and so who knows? And that's what's always been so exciting about this to me. What we can do with it today and what we all talk about today is interesting, but the most exciting piece is what we're not talking about. Yeah. And what we're going to be 5 years from now. Wow, who would have ever thought this? But it's because now really bright people working in research and development and in their basements of their house are going to come up with things they can do with 10 gigabits, you know. And my guess is the next thing will be 100 gigabits, you know, or 50 gigabits or whatever. But it's coming, you know. It's all coming.
Well, you obviously made a great partnership, and I'm really glad that you got to talk about this today, because I think that the history is very interesting. And if for people that won't go back and look up old newspaper clips, this will provide a current view of where we are and where it's going to launch Lafayette into the next phase of our growth and development. So I want to thank you for coming today, Joey, and sharing your thoughts. Yeah. Our immediate past president of Lafayette Parish, Joey Durel. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to now welcome Pat Ottinger, a well-known local attorney, and the attorney that served for most of Joey Durel's administration as city parish attorney. Pat, thank you for joining us on Discover Lafayette.
Thank you so much.
We've been talking about the history of the Fiber to the Home initiative, and we also talked about the obstacles that had to be overcome to enact this initiative. Would you talk about your early days? You were brought on with Joey Durel at the beginning of his term, and this initiative began just about on day one.
It did. It was one of the first things on our plate, if you will, coming in as the new administration, and it picked up a head of steam, and it was, looking back on it so many years later, it was quite a interesting but also challenging at time undertaking, all to the good of the city because of a vision that Terry Huval had, and I have heard that. Terry's sitting here. He talked to Joey pretty early on, and it started picking up steam, and Joey is such a progressive, if that's a proper word, but also looking for the opportunity to be visionary in terms of what Lafayette can be and became, I feel, a large part. And so it was a new initiative that it just fit that ticket, and he gave it his wholehearted blessing, and we all got to work with Terry's very steady hand, and here we are. So looking back on it, it's very, very fond memories, although not perhaps every day of the undertaking was necessarily fond.
Well, I'm looking back, you were not necessarily a government lawyer. You had to learn about local city parish ordinances, because you weren't just representing Mr. Durel or Terry Huval, you were representing the whole parish with all the different departments. And so figuring out the ropes and then having this occur must have been quite an undertaking.
It was, and the expression I use is learning curves. There were learning curves every day of that, of the term of being the city parish president. I refer to the government as probably the most interesting, unique client that one can have. There's so many moving parts, And under the charter, of course, the city parish attorney represents the administration, but also the council and the departments and commissions and what have you. So each of those present their own unique learning curve, and you have learning curves to the last day on the job, is the way I look at it. But again, this initiative, so important as it is in our community, presented another unique set of learning curves that we got through, and here we are. So very much, it's very accurate to say that I didn't come from any sort of old boy network and what have you, but rather we tried to get in and learn master those learning curves as best we could. And this one again was very, very early in the administration of Joey. He took office in January of 2004, and we hit the ground running.
And very quickly there were legal challenges thrown your way.
Right.
And I know first there was a vote by the City Parish Council, and then a vote of the people to approve the initial bond request for about $125 million. Can you recall some of the happenings during that time?
I do, and everything you said is accurate, but another element that I think is equally important, because it set laid the landscape for all the undertakings that you mentioned, was legislation. We found ourselves in a legislative process very quickly, and that is because in 2004 the United States Supreme Court decided a case called Nixon versus Municipal League. Nixon being the Attorney General of Missouri, not the former President of the United States. And the Supreme Court held that in the Telecommunications Act, that the preemption disallowing states to regulate entities seeking to get into the telecommunications business did not apply to municipalities or state governments, such that it is permissible, and double negatives there, for a state to engage in legislative undertakings with respect to these types of enterprises. And so what really happened was that the incumbent providers on a national basis undertook to go to state legislatures and put forth a piece of what is called model legislation. The word model is misleading. It really means off the shelf, because it was written with the interest of the traditional providers in mind, and it was in the term of Governor Blanco, and at her direction the parties got together in a conference room for days on end, and we worked on legislation that's called so-called Fair Competition Act. And I say that to say it had strong implications of the need for some of the hearings that were held, the referendum, and all of this in connection with bonding and whatnot. So another learning curve that we found ourselves pursuing very early on.
So Randy Haney had been retained, I think, as a local, I guess he's an advocate.
He's a governmental relations lobbyist, if you will, and he was very active in getting the parties together and trying to move that process along.
Right. So every state can enact its own laws then governing whether a city or municipality can implement its own fiber to the home or whatever they're trying to do.
Correct.
So,
or disallow it.
And disallow it.
Yes.
And I know in some states they will allow the wholesale sale of utilities, including internet. So this was a big hurdle, I guess, to get over that first one.
It was.
And then there was a vote of the people, and it was overwhelming, 62 to 38%.
Yes,
and,
it was a very exciting day. And what typical Lafayette fashion, as important as that was to the Fiber to the Home project, I recall very fondly all of the interest in the community with video competitions and rallies and what have you. And some of those were just hilarious. They really, really are. A lot of passion in the community, which I think paralleled and married up nicely with the pursuit of this project with the leadership of Joey Durel and the very steady hand of Terry Huval. So those were pretty heady days.
Yeah, we had discussed that really both sides of the fence, both politically and different economic classes, people really wanted to see this overall.
Exactly.
Even people that wouldn't typically agree on things were at the table.
That's true. It's very grassroots, and I mean, and I met some. I came to know some very interesting, passionate people, seeing the ability that Lafayette could undertake this and really bring world-class fiber, which we now have. So it was very interesting times at that time.
Now, we haven't discussed this, Terry, about what that vote really meant, but you didn't just happen to have $125 million laying around to implement fiber to the home. And so I know there was a bond issue to be, I guess money could be borrowed up to $125 million. But Pat, I was waiting for you to explain some of that, because this was what the financing option, or the financing need, was what allowed the city to move forward with finishing out the program.
Right.
So can you talk about that and what was involved?
Well, we have had, Lafayette has had very capable bond counsel for decades, if you will, and this is not your run-of-the-mill bond issue to build a road or even to expand electricity. It was a unique undertaking, so much so there was a lot of conversation about this notion of fiber. Is fiber a utility? Right. Which has its own implications. And so with the guidance of, first and foremost, Joey Durel, the steady hand of Terry Huval, the very capable assistance of the bond council, a bond ordinance was adopted to authorize the issuance of bonds up to $125,000. As I recall, there were $125 million. As I recall, there were multiple statutory paths that might have been taken, some that did and some that did not require a referendum. And we felt legitimately pursued bonding under a particular statutory path, and it was quickly challenged by some of the incumbent providers, if you will, and went through the courts and whatnot. So it came to be that the path that we then set upon did require this referendum, which again, because of Lafayette's, may I say, so-called consolidated government, the issues of whether the non-city residents are involved and so on and so forth come into play. So all of these issues, very, very heady and very, very multifaceted, but again, alluding to the citizenry of Lafayette who got very passionate, and we had these campaigns, very grassroots oriented, and I'm sure Terry ate more rubber chicken at Kiwanis clubs and Rotary clubs and Beaver clubs and any other club that would hear him. But the election was in July of 2005, as I recall, and had the result that you indicated, but the lawsuits were not over at that point.
Right, right. So once the parish was able to move forward, that's when litigation came up. I was challenging there were some technicalities that they were challenging.
That's right. That's a second set of litigation resulting in a lawsuit that went to the Supreme Court. And what was at issue was a reference in the, I say, so-called Fair Competition Act, very much of a misnomer, that seemed to, depending on how you read it, either authorize or deny the ability to pledge, that is to say, put up as security revenue from the system in support of the bonds. And we had lawsuits, of course, that started at the district court level, went to the Third Circuit, and then we went to the Supreme Court. These were brought by two individuals who no one knew who they were. I don't think we still know who they were. One of the two dropped out during the suit, so we're left with one individual, a citizen in Lafayette, and we ended up, through those, through all the processes involved, the case was argued at the Louisiana Supreme Court in November of 2006, as I recall. And footnote time right here, it was very interesting because that was almost a century to the day that the Louisiana Supreme Court, at the end of the twice previous century, authorized the creation of what is now called LUS to begin with. So this is our second time to go to the Louisiana Supreme Court for validation, and we received it in big form with a unanimous decision of the Supreme Court written by the Chief Justice, and it was a culmination of much a lot of work at multiple levels, and that gave us the final authority to issue the bonds and proceed to implement and deploy fiber to the home.
So you were really a part of history, along with Terry and Joey Durel and others, and I hadn't realized about the 100-year gap.
Right.
That's really amazing.
It was amazing.
How history repeated itself, that the community, through strong leaders, was moving forward.
It was.
In ways that we still don't know the outcome of all this, what it's going to do for our community. But those were heady times.
They were heady times. And Terry, as I recall, was at the first Supreme Court argument 2 centuries ago.
I see.
So
I knew he was experienced
exactly.
in his position, but you didn't quite explain that. So, yeah. So you served, I think, longer than any other city parish attorney for 7 years, and it sounds like the bulk of the real intense work was right at the beginning.
Well, certainly on that part. There are many other facets to the job, and so I think it is accurate to say that I've served longer in that position since consolidation in 1996, I think. So it's very fond memories. Never a dull moment, lots of learning curves, all those cliches, but one of the biggest joys I have in looking back was the involvement in the fiber to the home, which I think is of such significance to our community and is a model not only for the state but for the country in terms of internet speeds and community involvement. It's very exciting, yes.
And I know, Pat, you're I don't want to call you a geek, but I know you're a techie and you really like your devices, and I'm sure this has really impacted your law practice.
It has.
Teaching at LSU, you've got your oil and gas practice, you travel quite a bit, and just what we experienced here in Lafayette, has it really made your law practice run more smoothly?
It has, because I don't remember when speeds were as primitive as they might have been before fiber to the home, but I personally get the biggest package that's available out there, and I just love the speed, upload, download, all these things. I learned a lot about what does fiber to the home mean, and fiber optics, and as compared to the bottleneck created when, yes, fiber might be used, but at some point they convert to literally the old-fashioned copper wire that telephones grew up on, or whatever. And so the implications to speed that therefore assist one in their business, whatever it might be, but certainly in my law practice, it's a great component. I can't imagine practicing law without fiber to the home.
Right.
Absolutely.
And I've experienced personally, I know you've enjoyed your relationship with Terry Huval. Would y'all talk about that some? Did you know each other before Pat came on as city parish attorney?
No, did not.
I echo that. Everybody knew Terry, but no one knew me, and I'm fine with that. But
well, I don't know if they didn't know you,
well,
but I didn't think you guys had interacted before. Just two totally different paths.
According to Joey, people knew me from being in England Weber's commercial.
Apparently so. I understand. Well, similarly, when Joey asked me to serve, I'd never met Joey. So Joey's not a long friend of mine. I said, Joey, I just need to tell you, I didn't vote for you. I voted for him the second time, but the first time I voted for someone who's a family friend or whatever. But he said, I don't care, just do a good job. And Joey never one time sought to influence me to go a certain direction or lay down an edict that I must do this or hire this person or whatever. He just let me do my job for better or worse, and had great regard for him. But one of the both pleasures and responsibilities as city parish attorney is that one is the chief legal counsel to each department, and therefore every department head is really a client in a sense. And whether it's public works or traffic and transportation, or the police department or fire department, same with the utilities department. So I had many opportunities to work with Terry, and of all the departments, all are important, but none is as unique as utilities department, LUS, because of its the magnitude of the enterprise and the importance to deliver quality electricity and water and so on and so forth. And then fiber, as I said earlier, what is fiber? Is it a utility for a variety of purposes? Came to be a very important component of that relationship. So I look back fondly with working with Terry and all of his staff and heads of his offices here at LUS.
Do you think that the internet or fiber, is that a utility? Has that been defined as a utility anywhere?
That was one of the very interesting questions, and I will answer by first saying there was a time when ice was a utility. Right. And ice was purchased through your local utility department. And we're all comfortable with the notion of electricity and water and gas, if that were the case, being a utility. But we never had a hard need to really make the fine definition that it is or is not. But the courts were starting to speak to that issue, and I think it meets certain definitions of utilities, which has implications in the ability to expropriate or to raise money through bonding and what have you. So that's not a black and white answer so much, but I would be comforted with the notion that it does have the implications of a utility.
Yeah, it certainly seems like a utility, and my husband's family actually owned the ice plant in Lake Charles,
right.
And I think Judge Swift's father, Gogo Swift,
right.
he ended up with Gulf States.
Okay.
But it was, they
Right.
had the ice plant,
Right.
and I guess people couldn't have survived without that. So
Absolutely.
maybe the question is, can we survive without fiber or without internet? And I don't think so.
I couldn't.
don't
I
think
couldn't.
so.
Once you get it and enjoy it, understand it, and use it daily,
Right.
that's another component of being a utility. I must have my fiber or what have you.
It's a safety thing
Absolutely.
at this point. So,
Right.
Yeah.
So.
Do you have anything to add that I haven't asked you? Any thoughts?
No, other than just echoing what I've said, in numerous contexts in which I had occasion to counsel and work with the Utilities Department embodied by Terry, as well as my assistant attorneys who might on a more daily basis do that, it was always a very important issue, which is fine, and always done in an ethical, professional manner, whether it's embodied by Terry but also by others under his guidance. So you don't pick and choose your favorite department, but I certainly had great pleasure and honor in representing the Utilities Department all the way to the Supreme Court in that one case and what have you.
I can imagine that.
Right.
Well, Pat Ottinger, thank you
Thank
for
you so much
joining
for
us
having me.
today. And Terry Huval, thank you for this opportunity to shine the light on all the good that Lafayette Utility System has done and what government can do for the people. I think we're very fortunate to have you at the helm of Lafayette Utility System, and let's look forward and see what's going to happen with Lafayette because of your service. Thank you.
May I add my congratulations and thank you for the opportunity to work with you on these projects over the years. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you, Jan.
Pat. And I just wanted to mention Pat. I did not know him at all, but he, brilliant attorney and just a fun attorney. You know, some attorneys might be smart, but not as much fun as Pat is. Pat got the benefit of both, being brilliant and being fun to have around, and very resourceful. You know, just all these things we had to deal with. We were dealing against some very well-heeled companies that had lots of resources, that had kind of planned their strategy for many, many years as to how they were going to handle things like this, and we were just lambs in the field on this one here. But despite that we were lambs, we moved quickly, and Pat and the legal team he put together just blew it away. That whole thing about going to the Supreme Court and preparing for that, the people, resources you brought to the table, because of the relationships you had, because if you'd been in the bar association, the head of the bar association in the state for a while, and so you knew some people that could bring some insights and some approaches to us that could help us be successful, and doggone it worked. It was a real proud moment for all of us when that happened.
That was a great day.
It was.
It certainly was. Yes.
Yeah. Pat's reputation is just impeccable. in our community, not only in Lafayette, Louisiana, but nationally. So it's quite a good team here.
Thank you.
So thank you both. On behalf of Lafayette Utility System, I'd like to thank you for watching this in-depth episode of Discover Lafayette. And if you're listening to the podcast edition, you can catch this episode and all of our episodes on discoverlafayette.net. On behalf of Discover Lafayette, I'm Jan Swift. Thank you.